The mission of CSPS is to discover the ideas that enrich humanity for an ethical, sustainable, equitable, and just future. CSPS believes in diversity, plurality of ideas and disciplines, and it draws inspiration from Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar, Mahatma Gandhi, and Subhash Chandra Bose, and all other international personalities who have contributed to making a plural and multicultural world. So our center aims at studying all issues, problems of the country in a complete, objective, scientific, and disciplined way, guided by the universal values of pluralism. And we encourage young scholars and researchers to advance their research skill and be a part of the internationally recognized research and development community. So that's a brief introduction of our organization, what we do and what we aim to do in future. So the speaker for today's talk is Dr. Preetha Mani. She's an assistant professor at South Asian Literatures at Rutgers, if I'm pronunciation correctly, University. Her areas of interest are modern Hindi, Tamil, and Indian literature, South Asian feminisms, women's writing, world literature, translational studies, realisms and modernisms, and post-colonial studies. And her current book project, which she's working on, examines Hindi and Tamil short story writing between the 1930s and the 1960s to explore how representations of Indian women were used to shape ideas of regional and national identity and experiences of belonging in the aftermath of Indian independence. Her book is titled The Idea of Indian Literature, Gender, Genre, and Comparative Method. The book proposes a view of Indian literature as a field of comparative literature that is comprised of mutually imbricated local, regional, national, and global process of literary canonization. She has enduring interest in the relationship between gender and genre, and the popular and the literary, which informs her ongoing work on the comparative study of India and the world literatures. And we have our chair, Dr. Poorna Banerjee. He's an associate professor at the Presidency University of Kolkata. Prior to this, she taught at University of Rochester, Texan Christian University, and Millikan University. Poorna Banner, she specializes in Victorian and modernist novels, periodicals, travel literatures, and in the post-colonial Anglophone traditions. Her research continues to be on the constructions of female subject in situation of cultural marginality and epistemic violence. She has also deep interest in oral and prose narratives and poems produced by displaced women. And she teaches British literature, Victorian novel, modernist literature, literature by women, and post-colonial Anglophone literature. So over to you, Dr. Banerjee. I can take the floor from here and then we can start with the talk.
I think, should we go ahead with the talk first and then pose the questions, or should we?
Absolutely, we can go ahead with the talk and then simultaneously after the talk, we can take the questions.
I think that would be, much more logical to do that. I do have a couple of, questions for Dr. Mani, and I'm looking forward to her talk. I believe she's in Rutgers, so it was not Rutgers, but Rutgers. And her book is already coming out this year, right? It is in publication already, I believe. So congratulations to her. We look forward to this wonderful talk of hers. Dr. Mani, over to you.
Okay, this sounds wonderful. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for this very kind invitation to speak, and to all of you for taking time on a Friday evening. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. And I thought I would take this opportunity to talk, to share a part of the forthcoming book. It's actually coming out in August of this year, so I can't wait. And the portion I would like to share with you focuses on post-independence male writers associated with the Hindi Nayi Kahani movement and the Tamil publishing house Yerthe. So the book largely compares Hindi and Tamil literature to explore the feasibility and durability of the idea of Indian literature and its capacity to collect diverse literary and linguistic strategies and aims beneath the auspices of a single rubric. The argument of the chapter from which I'm presenting today is that a common anxiety about feminine desire, which was shared across the Hindi and Tamil literary spheres, recruited readers into relations of empathy by making the positions of characters and readers transpositional. Feminine desire thereby allowed the idea of Indian literature to function as a capacious signifier for diverse experiences of post-colonial indignation and disconsolation. In this talk, I want to elaborate the role of feminine desire in post-colonial literature and society more broadly through the short stories of Hindi writer Mohan Rakesh and Tamil writer D. Jayakanthan. Feminine desire repeatedly undermined conventional notions of heterosexual propriety in Hindi Nayi Kahani and Tamil short stories from the 1950s and 60s. Unlike late colonial era fiction, in which depictions of feminine desire served to reinforce the Hindu conjugal family ideal, post-independence stories portrayed feminine desires as beyond patriarchal control. The post-independence new woman worked outside the home, sought romantic companionships of her own choosing, postponed or rejected marriage, divorced, and even had affairs. She was a misfit, a renegade, and a seeker of pleasure. Her longings exceeded socially sanctioned behaviors and objectives, and for this reason, the new woman's interiority became a promising cache, ripe for aesthetic exploration. Rather than displaying wayward feminine desire as problematic, Nayi Kahani and Yertha short stories used this desire to proffer the new woman as an archetypal sign of the times. They drew parallels between questions related to the new woman's position. What did she want? How would she fulfill her ambitions? Who would be her patriarchal guardian? And anxieties about post-independence community. Just as these stories construed feminine desire as insatiable and unlocatable, so too did they assume the yearnings of readers to be without resolution. In this way, the new woman's inscrutable wants sought to give form to the uncertainties prompted by post-independence social and political transformations. Discussing the portrayal of the feminine figure in 1950s and 60s Indian literature and film, Geeta Kapoor argues that, quote, what is interrogated is bad faith in interpersonal relationships. While in an earlier phase of nationalist consciousness, there was an ebullience of self-discovery through mythic archetype, folk and myth and popular forms, now there is the travail of the middle class worked out in psychosocial terms, unquote. In Nayi Kahani and Yertha stories of this period, this middle class psychosocial drama played out on the terrain of feminine desire. Bad faith, when a person chooses to believe falsely in a story that he has told himself so that he can avoid the truth of his own freely chosen actions, emerged from a tension between socially accepted models for heterosexual relations and the new woman, whose wants were consistently and hopelessly misaligned. Within this framework, the enigma of feminine desire conveyed a nebulous sense of agitation, the literary correlative of the precariousness comprising post-independence life. Within Nayi Kahani and Yertha frameworks of literary sentiment, apprehensions surrounding the new woman's hopes and ambitions served to bracket the problem of identitarian difference. Through representations of the new woman, writers refracted bad faith communal and caste relations through the lens of discordant heterosexual longing. In North India, Hindi writers were painfully aware of the weight of partition on the cultural imaginary, and they could not ignore the emotional trauma that it triggered. At the same time, an overarching post-colonial mandate to suture fractures of difference led them to avoid addressing the communal question head-on. Partition entered Nayi Kahani stories obliquely. Muslim identity took on spectral manifestations, and secular critiques of the Indian bureaucracy replaced those confronting religious hypocrisy. Supplementing these moves, Nayi Kahani representations of the new woman initiated the interiorizing of the profound experiences of loss, displacement, and brutal injury that partition engendered. They mapped these mental and physical wounds onto the psychic anatomy of Hindi protagonists by portraying partition's nightmarish events in the terms of unrequited love. Protagonists' inability to understand the new woman's desires and their acute futility of their longings to establish companionate relations with her stood in place of the communal question. These sentiments opened an admissible and intimate pathway for grappling with the inarticulable problem of religious difference. In South India, Tamil writers faced a different historical conundrum framed predominantly in the terms of caste. The deep-seated anti-Brahmanism of Dravidianist discourses spurred a paradoxical response among Yurtha writers to cling to, rather than distance themselves from, Brahmin culture and identity. This inclination influenced the content of their stories as much as the positions they expounded in their literary criticism. Using representations of the new woman, Yurtha writers zoomed in on Brahmin geographies of domesticity, the layout of the Brahmin home and its immediate surroundings, the dialectical speech spoken within Brahmin spaces, and the hopes and dreams arising in opposition to antiquated Brahmin values, customs, and family structure. Confronted by anti-Brahmin sentiment in the political sphere, Yurtha writers limited their settings to the interior realms that the new woman traversed, and they used her desires to translate their representations of Brahmin life into a rift between tradition and modernity. Within this framework, the new woman's reformist sensibilities provided an avenue for sidestepping the caste question by expressing it as an appeal for cultural modernization. So in what follows, I first will illustrate how Rakesh's and Jayakanthan's stories use feminine desire to manage the injuries of communal and caste difference, respectively. And then I'm going to turn to two more of their short stories to show how the figure of the new woman sublimated community and caste tensions along the axis of heterosexual relations. So let me first turn to Mohan Rakesh's 1960 short story, Admi Aur Diwar, The Man and the Wall, to illustrate how post-independence short stories tried to absorb the injuries of partition into a broader aesthetic of alienation. The story is undeniably about partition, although it functions tangentially within the plot. The opening scene, in which the protagonist Sateh stares at the unsightly graffiti on his bedroom wall, brings this immediately into focus. Quote, "That wooden wall had a personality of its own. Different types of scripts carved by nails and knives were all over it. In one corner was carved in deep Farsi letters, Shireen Mumtaz alias Urf Mumtaz Mahal. In the opposite corner, as if to balance out the communal account, someone much later had engraved her name in Devanagari letters, Damo alias Atart Damayanti. In the middle of the wall, spread out over something like 1.5 feet, someone had added his name, Billu. Beneath it, in crooked letters, someone had later appended alias Blue Black. In nearly the same place, in Farsi letters, was written, Here I leave my soul, Ru, Shireen Mumtaz, 13/8/47. Where the wall abutted the door frame, someone had written hurriedly, as if at the very moment of departure, I love you, mujhe tumse muhabbat hai. Beneath this was a comment, my love, are you female, nar, or male, mada? There was the eye of an otter, which put an ominous shadow over the whole wall, a deep wound created by a futile attempt to scratch out the wall in that spot, unquote. To a Hindi reader, the communalized identities of the various inscriptions are stark. Shireen, whose name and appearance in the Farsi script mark her as Muslim, compares herself to Mumtaz Mahal, for whom the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. Damo counters with a Hindu rejoinder in Sanskritic Devanagari script, renaming herself Damayanti, the virtuous wife of King Mela in the Mahabharata. The unmistakable communal associations of these legendary characters seem to heighten the hostility between Shireen and Damo. Billu, a nickname used for males of both communities, appears trivial by comparison. This name and its epithet, blue-black, both written in English in the Roman script, together suggest an emasculated identity. 13th August 1947, the eve of Indian and Pakistani independence, is conspicuous amidst the inscriptions. The date intimates that Shireen's departure may have been compelled, or that she may have been killed or died by suicide. Her interlocutors use distinctly Perso-Arabic vocabulary to respond to her with love, longing, and curiosity. Last and most enigmatic of all is the otter's eye, which has no script, vocabulary, or timestamp to signal its identity. In contrast to the scribblings, the eye appears as sheer violence, ready to swallow the voices calling out from the wall. Throughout the story, the graffiti confronts Satye. He is a writer unable to overcome his writer's block, yet stories are all around him. Shirin, Dhammo, Billu, the otter's eye, all develop intriguing personalities. Their messages are remnants of those whose desires have been blotted out by partition. But Satye focuses on the longings they express instead. The romantic stories that Satye constructs around the names are tinged with viraha, the poetic trope of anguish caused by separation from one's lover. Dhammo's and Shirin's links to the fabled love stories of Nala and Damayanti and Shah Jahan and Mumtaz, respectively, strengthen these sentiments. Viraha is Satye's persistent fascination. Through this affective complex, the story positions readers in a frame of empathetic identification with readily recognizable characters and tropes. The narrative apposition of Satye's musings about the wall and his ruminations about his own experiences is not accidental. It serves to intertwine Satye's desires with the wall's multiple articulations, placing them together on a shared plane. The wall extends the metaphor of partition. Quote, some tenants had put up the wooden partition to divide the room into two parts. Now the other side stored useless things, empty bottles, old gas cylinders, torn burlap sacks, broken chairs, different kinds of baskets, sickles, wooden platters, and a tin tub that had not been used to heat water for years. That room was like a small graveyard where countless things had been buried for who knows how long, their ancient histories gathered up within them, unquote. The inventory in this passage forms a metonymic chain that leads straight to partition, suggesting that partition itself must be partitioned off from reality, like the useless items tucked behind the wall. Satye's longings are etched over their concealed histories. At the end, Satye takes a knife to the wall. Exhausted, he sits back to observe his creation. Quote, now no indication of Shirin Mumtaz remained, but that deformed eye, more deformed than before, stared back at him through the gaping hole that he had made, unquote. Satye's first act of post-independence writing is an unconsciously driven, vexed effacement of partition that submerges its histories within the cavernous recesses of his mind. Due to the geographical distance, the trauma of partition and the communal tensions it engendered did not encumber the Tamil cultural imaginary as much as in North India. The political arena was dominated by questions of caste instead. Tamil writers like Jayakanthan bracketed these questions, however, by translating Brahmanism into a call for progress. They focused on the Brahmin home, where changing caste-based norms could be re-articulated in the universal discourse of tradition and modernity. Jayakanthan's Nan Janal Arohe Utkandirkiren, or I Sit by the Window, illustrates this process beautifully. Written in 1969, the story is presented as the stream of consciousness of an unnamed elderly Brahmin woman who recounts her life story as she sits on the windowsill, watching the street from her home. Her tone is irreverent and angry, a challenge to patriarchy. She describes how her father relegated her to the status of a servant after her mother died. Denied the right to marry, she began to look out the window in search of respite. Refusing to budge from the windowsill for years, she mourns her life's stasis as the world around her has changed. The story's plot is quite ordinary, a recognizable tale of patriarchal oppression in which the Brahmin woman's suffering sheds light on the need for social reform. However, I also view Jayakanthan's depiction of the narrator's life as extraordinary for the ways that it circumscribes feminine desire. The edifice of the home, particularly the window, illuminates her longings. Necessary for the narrator's survival, the window forms a physical threshold between inside and outside, from which she may live out her experiences that she has never been allowed to live. It is an extension of her own corporeality. When the narrator's father catches her watching a marriage procession from the window one day, he reads her gaze as an expression of excessive sexual desire that must be contained. the narrator finds herself reduced to sexual desire and questions whether such desire could be wrong. Through intimate glimpses into the narrator's tenuous position, the story invites readers to enter into an empathetic web with her. Within it, the narrator's afflictions summon readers' shared sense of indignation towards the strictures of outdated tradition. With nowhere else to go, the narrator moves inwards into surreal spaces. She describes a dreamlike sequence of events, which she has come to view as ordinary. Quote, "One day I was surrounded only by window. The walls were window, only window. There was no sill, nowhere to lean my back against or prop my feet. It was like a cage, a prison. Could it have been a lie, a dream?" Another time, an elephant came through the window. It slipped its waving trunks between the bars of the window and touched my cheek. I shivered, but it also felt good. The elephant stuck its long trunk completely into the room and groped around to catch hold of me. Little by little, that elephant flattened his body and slid itself entirely through the window bars. Now it stood in its original shape in the middle of the room, its back smashed against the ceiling. How pleasurable it was. The elephant wrapped its trunk around me, tugging me to come with it. Carrying me, the elephant retreated the way it had come. When I got to the window, I leaned my back firmly against one side of the frame and pushed my feet up against the other, as if latching a bolt across the door. How could I have slipped out like that elephant? Unquote. The double dream sequence is enigmatic. The windowed space, both without frame or sill, unsettles the narrator. She views the all-encompassing window as both bounded and boundaryless, almost imaginable and possibly unreal. By contrast, her physical contact with the elephant is descriptively concrete. It incites pleasure and excitement. The experience seems to satiate the narrator's otherwise irresolvable desire, leading her to accept and even to affirm the impossibility of crossing the perimeter of the Brahmin home. The story critiques outdated Brahmin traditions, while also resurrecting the Brahmin woman as a central figure of modernity. She must stay confined within the home because this is the only sanctioned place for her to grow. While her family members view the narrator's body, and by extension the Brahmin home, as requiring protection, the dream sequence illustrates how this edifice is nonetheless vulnerable to penetration. As if to lessen the threat, the narrator casts vulgar feminine desire into a private, fantastical realm. The incident both confirms and transgresses conservative Brahmin norms. Against this impulse to reinvent Brahmanism, the narrator's dream of the unbounded window emerges as an aporia. It suggests the narrator's inability to imagine a world unbounded by caste, going even beyond gender, a place where all desire may have limitless expression. Closing off this possibility, the narrator replaces a possible interrogation of caste with a tentative resolution to the question of feminine desire. This story, like Rakesh's, invites readers to participate in the post-colonial discontent spurred by the incomprehensibility of feminine desire. In place of communal and caste affiliations, both stories construct feminine desire as the constitutive intuition for creating empathetic connections with protagonists. In this way, bringing otherwise divergent Hindi and Tamil aesthetic frameworks together under the auspices of Indian literature. So now let me turn to two other stories where I consider how Rakesh and Jayakanthan used the problem of feminine desire to position male and female characters in new heterosexual paradigms. So first Rakesh's story, Ek Aur Zindagi, or Another Life. It was published in 1961 and is written in the third person. The narrative of this short story is focalized through the perspective of Prakash, who has been staying a few days in Kilanmarg, a valley in Kashmir. The plot line is straightforward. Prakash has divorced his first wife, Beena, and desperately misses their young son, Palash. He is also estranged from his second wife, Nirmala, and has arrived in Kilanmarg after walking out on her. Fortuitously, Prakash meets Beena and Palash, who are also vacationing in the mountains. But nothing momentous happens in Ek Aur Zindagi. At the story's conclusion, Prakash remains as alone as he was in the beginning. The changing weather, torrential rain, shifting clouds, dense fog, is almost character-like in the story. Descriptions of its unpredictable, unreadable moods feature prominently, more prominently than any descriptions of Prakash's actions or mental states. The narrative offers these descriptions in lieu of insights into Prakash's desires, to give readers a sense of how much Prakash lacks mental clarity and how lonely and depressed he feels. Quote, "The fog slowly grew so dense that no form or color was visible from Prakash's balcony. Sitting in his chair, he sometimes felt as if the balcony were some kind of secret province in the skies, sky upon sky above and below, a bottomlessness over which the balcony held authority as an independent world of its own." Unquote. The fog hampers Prakash's ability to distinguish between internal and external realities. It maps Prakash's inner state, drawing readers into his ulterior reality. Within this hazy realm, Prakash is enveloped by uncertainty about what he truly sees or feels. Prakash's relationships with Bina and Palash are just as wavering as his visions of landscape and weather. Prakash adores his son, yet he has forsaken his paternal responsibilities and has become a peripheral figure in his son's life. Bina questions Prakash's right to be in contact with Palash and urges him to move on. Narratively, Palash serves to constantly remind readers of Prakash's failures as a father, a husband, and a man. His presence discloses Prakash's deep desire for human connection, a desire that is heterosexual at heart. Prakash's deep satisfaction and unease with both his wives, Bina, whom he divorced several years before, and Nirmala, from whom he has now run away, prevent him from establishing another life. His major dilemma is that he doesn't know what kind of woman he wants. In a flashback that lies at the core of the story, Prakash pits Bina against Nirmala. Quote, "The question arose in his mind afresh. Why couldn't he completely free himself from the past? But when he began to imagine starting a new life, he kept coming up against a doubt. How could he say that his second attempt would be successful when his first attempt was not? Although he hadn't given it a clear thought, it seemed to him that he wanted to spend his life with the kind of woman who was completely the opposite of Bina. Bina was extremely arrogant, equally educated to him, earned more than him. She took great pride in her independence and believed that she could confront any situation on her own. Physically, too, Bina was quite tall. She was stronger than him, and she spoke openly as would a man. Now Prakash wanted a woman who was dependent on him in every way, whose weakness required her to take refuge in a man. And Nirmala was just such a woman. She was a simple, naive girl who lowered her eyes when she spoke. She was of average education and lived an ordinary life. Prakash unwittingly felt sympathy toward her when he saw her." Unquote. Bina emerges as a type, a new modern woman whose independence and intellectual and physical superiority threaten Prakash. Nirmala is Bina's foil, a traditional good wife who stirs Prakash's sympathy and hope for a normal, settled life. Yet the story also undermines the validity of these types, questioning their relevance in the post-independence moment. For example, after their marriage, Prakash soon discovers that Nirmala is crazed, possibly insane. Quote, "She would loosen her hair like a goddess and say, 'You want to divorce me like you did Bina, but I'm not Bina. She wasn't a good wife. I am a good wife, a Sati Nari. I will unsettle this house brick by brick.' If Prakash tried to placate her, she would say, 'Don't touch me. I am a wife. I am a goddess. Do you wish to destroy my wifehood? I'm still a virgin. I'm a small child. No man in this world can touch me. I live a divine life. But you must let me sleep beside you. Am I a widow who should sleep alone? I am an auspicious married woman. Does any married woman sleep alone?" Unquote. Nirmala's perverted mobilization of traditional understandings of wifehood is striking. Even as she intentionally embodies prescribed womanhood, she exceeds its boundaries, exposing its horrifying impracticality to meet Prakash's needs as a modern man. Her madness renders the Sati type literally excessive and logically impossible, driving Prakash into a alienated mental state. Bina too moved beyond the type of new woman, contributing to Prakash's sense of isolation. Her desires are illegible. Upon meeting in Kilanmar, Prakash and Bina share a few momentary glimpses, but like the impenetrable fog, Bina's inner state remains opaque. Prakash discovers that Bina and Palash are traveling with another woman, whose relationship to Bina is ambiguous, yet also seemingly sordid. When Prakash has a brief exchange with the woman before taking his son for the afternoon, Bina calls after him, quote, "Look, I wanted to tell you something," said Bina. "Tell me," Prakash replied. Bina remained quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "Don't tell Palash anything that might." Prakash felt as if something were lacerating his nerves. He lowered his eyes and slowly replied, "No, I won't mention anything like that," unquote. Unspoken, though implied in the ellipses in this passage, is the possibility of Bina's love affair with the strange woman and with other men. Bina sits uncomfortably with the new woman type. Her masculine physicality and mannerisms, her inscrutable gazes and actions, and her romantic relationships with other men and possibly women make her unknowable, rather than the predictably westernized, lecherous, and materialistic new woman of the late colonial era. Bina and Prakash's final meeting in Kilanmark, which brings Bina to inexplicable tears, propels Prakash into deep depression. As the story ends, Prakash drunkenly walks out into the torrential rain, having gambled away everything. Prakash is alienated because he desires something different than the socially accepted norms that the good wife and new woman types represent. In the fog and rain, he searches for a new form of interpersonal relations that remains unrealized, hidden deep within Prakash's subconscious desires. The bad faith that sets Prakash adrift is the result of the wrongs that Prakash feels Nirmala and Bina have committed against him. Both women fail to fulfill the requirements of the types they reference, propelling Prakash into an unknowable abyss. Questioning the relevance of the good wife and the new woman, Bina and Nirmala represent a departure from the use of feminine types in pre-independence Hindi fiction. Earlier, the good wife was a character that evoked sympathy in both protagonists and readers. For example, the eponymous female protagonists in Premchand's Nirmala and Jainedra's Sunita are traditional good wives who return to the socially sanctioned domestic fold, even if they initially deviate from it. The desires of these new women align with the social types that they portray, suggesting that they are worthy of readerly sympathy and compassion. Rakesh's Bina and Nirmala, by contrast, are almost unrecognizable as types. Their motivations and desires are difficult to identify. For this reason, these characters push readers to move beyond the subjectivities associated with the new woman and good wife types. Vocalized through Prakash's perspective, the story aligns readers with male confusion about and estrangement from post-independence feminine desire, gesturing toward new, as yet unsolidified configurations of heterosexual relations. Although Jayakanthan's Agni Pravesham, or the Trial by Fire, is a very different story, it employs landscape descriptions to develop its characters and explore feminine types in a manner similar to Rakesh's Ek Aur Zindagi. Published in 1966, the story immediately aroused controversy for depicting the rape of an adolescent Brahmin girl. Written in the third person, the story follows the unnamed protagonist during an evening in which she is raped and then ceremoniously purified by her mother. The narrative is highly cinematic. From a vivid description of a rainbow-colored flock of college women huddled under umbrellas in the pouring rain, it turns to the protagonist, standing alone, younger than the rest, exceptional because of her tattered clothes. Lower middle class, naive and unprotected, she waits to catch the bus home. The narrator portrays her as both virginal and extraordinary. Quote, standing there, now drenched by rain, her shapely ivory legs turned blue and trembling, her worn blouse and half sari glued to her body, her tiny figure shrunken in the cold. She is poised like a goddess, and one feels simply like carrying her away, unquote. As darkness descends and the downpour increases, the narrator describes her innocence and beauty as risks. A handsome young man stops to offer her a ride, and the girl is drawn to his car. Quote, she stares at the car, beautiful, sweeping her eyes over it from the rear all the way to the driver's seat in astonishment, unquote. The young man ushers her inside his vehicle under the pretense of rescuing her from the rain. As he drives her through the city, the girl observes glowing street lamps, wide streets, tall buildings, and beautiful bungalows. The glamour of these urban surroundings envelops the young girl, conveying to readers her sense of unbelonging. Fearfully, the girl soon realizes that the young man has taken her somewhere out of the city. Still, she continues to feel exhilarated by the new things around her, the car's motorized gadgets, the plush seats, the blaring radio. She also begins to observe the man. Quote, he is pretty good looking, tall, brown clothes tightly clinging to his body. His skin glows in the dim light. She is reminded of the beauty of a magnificent, deadly serpent. Looking at him from behind, she can see only his left eye. It draws light and sparkles. His hair worn crotch, so short that no wind could dishevel it, and longish sideburns that glimmer in the diminishing light. When he looks back through the rearview mirror, she thinks for a moment that it would be nice if that bright face had a thin mustache, unquote. Told from the girl's perspective, this passage charts her sexual attraction to the stranger, bracketed by the ominous landscape, enveloping darkness, torrential rain, and the desolate field in which the car now stands. Her attraction for the man is unhindered. The narrative continuously moves between portentous descriptions of the environment and the girl's curiosity and desire, countering her physical sensations of arousal with more socially permissible feelings of terror linked to her current vulnerability. Through filmic cutting between the menacing landscape and the girl's observations, the story encourages readers to identify with the girl's artless exhilaration while simultaneously foreshadowing impending danger. When the young man climbs into the back seat beside her, tempting her with chocolate and gum, the girl's arousal remains firm. Quote, refusing to place the gum in her hand, he holds it up to her face, places it upon her lips, and lightly brushes it across them. Her head feels on fire, and a pleasant burning sensation runs through her body, unquote. Even when he assaults her, a trace of this sensation lingers. Quote, may I kiss you? He asks. She has no idea what to say. In the cold, her face is sweating and her body trembling. Suddenly, as if the tips of her ears, her cheeks, and her lips were being scorched by fire, she shudders in his arms. Please, please, she screams as he embraces her with violent passion. Her shrieks grow fainter and fainter and finally cease. Then, as if arbitrating his final verdict, her hands fasten tightly around his neck. Outside, the sky is torn apart. Lightning scatters. Sounds of thunder rumble and crackle. Oh, where has the thunder struck? Unquote. The alarming weather mirrors the terrible event taking place in the car. The young man overpowers the girl and violates her. Attempting to retain control of her body, the girl clasps her hand around his neck, an action astonishingly close to a reciprocating embrace. This is not to argue that the girl's response is one of roused passion or even resigned acceptance. The brief passage is not detailed enough to suggest either of these readings. Yet the narrator's ambivalent choice of words to describe this fateful moment leaves a space for the girl to retain possession of her sexual desire, the judgment of the stormy skies notwithstanding. Throughout the story, the young man is portrayed as manipulative, callous, and self-serving. Even when he tries to apologize, he only attests to his degenerate nature. The young man's sexual desire is depicted as intrinsic to his masculinity. Masculine desire is the ugly underbelly of modern urban freedom. This is why the girl must return to her home to find safety and redemption. When the girl tells her mother what has happened, her mother beats her with disgust. Suddenly, realizing the uselessness of punishing her daughter, the mother pulls her into the bathroom and bathes her with buckets of water. She advises her daughter to never tell a soul about the incident, exclaiming, quote, you're clean now, child. The water I poured on you isn't water. Think of it as fire. There are no blemishes upon you now. Don't you know the story of Ahalya? They say that she was purified when the dust of Lord Ram's foot touched her, but her mind was never impure. Take care that your own mind doesn't become impure, unquote. The mother forces her daughter to undergo the proverbial trial by fire, named after the Agni Pariksha episode in the Ramayana in which Sita steps into the flames to prove her loyalty to Lord Rama. She also compares her daughter to Ahalya, whose ascetic husband turned her to stone after Indra disguised himself as her husband to sleep with her. Emphasizing Ahalya's purity of mind, the mother reinforces her daughter's moral fortitude and renews her virginal purity. The girl now moves with savvy through the modern city, careful not to cross paths with luring cars or strange men. She walks with confidence, her eyes shining with, quote, the light of maturity and womanhood, unquote. So I just wanted to wrap up that this is very different. This representation of Ahalya is very different from late colonial era Tamil stories, which also portray Ahalya, but which show her and characters like Sita as not unable to actually overcome the trauma of their husband's betrayal of them. And so here you see the girl as someone who emerges from this experience, sort of learn with education and maturity, and she's able to manage and even critique the problematic representation of male desire in this moment. And so by way of conclusion, what I would like to just say is that in both Rakesh's and Jayakanthan's and Jayakanthan's stories, disconnection was fashioned by an anxiety about managing feminine desire. Questions surrounding what the post-independence new woman wanted, whether her longings were defensible, and who would be responsible for overseeing her ambitions, propelled the actions of Nayi Kahani and Year, the protagonists. Nayi Kahani and Year, the fiction, universalized feminine desire as the preeminent concern of post-independence existence. In place of communal and caste affiliations, this fiction constructed feminine desire as the constitutive intuition for creating empathetic connections with protagonists. So across these two Indian literatures, bad faith relationships between male and female characters realigned bad faith communal and caste alliances around precarious new paradigms of heterosexual relations. So thank you so much. And I sincerely for taking too long.
Thank you. It was, wonderful. And these are sort of facile words, but it really was very illuminating. And I learned a lot from you. I come to post-colonial literature from the, vector of Anglophone tradition. So I am not as aware and as well read in the vernacular literature. I do wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I found it very interesting that at no point, especially in the context of Prakash's story, if you would perhaps reflect on, was there ever a question in Prakash's mind or in the narrative about the new kind of man, that he seems so dissatisfied with the two binaries of the new woman and the good woman, the angel and the angel and the new woman, both of them do not fulfill their end of the discursive bargain. But is there any indication that there is a questioning of what kind of a man one needs to be in this post-independence era? So that would be my first question there. And my other question is about the elderly woman, the Brahmin elderly woman in the Tamil text, where she has this phallic dream of the elephant coming, although her sexuality is contained, but it is also a bit exhibitionist, is it not? Because it reminded me of her window, sort of surreal room. It reminded me of visiting the Dali Museum in Paris, or going to Netherlands and Amsterdam, where you have in the red light area, you have these windows where women project themselves. So there is a certain element of exhibitionism and performance built into her dream of this elephant, or even before the elephant enters, that her dream of making herself a part of the spectral and specular economy, so to speak. So that would be my second question, that is performance, is there an awareness of her performance in there and her enjoyment in her performance, in her visual performance there? And well, I'll let you speak to these two and then we'll get to, might be other questions from other people.
Thank you so much. These are both really wonderful readings of these two stories. With regard to whether there's a kind of idea of male, the new post-independence man should be like, no. In fact, I don't see this in most of the stories. And what it is that the male figures always knew who they were until the new woman becomes this new kind of woman. And when they cannot, when they fail to be recognized as men by these female characters, that's when they lose their stability and they're unable to sort of navigate the world. I realized in the story about Satye that I had to cut out a lot of the story in my reading of it, but you know, there are moments in that story too where he falls in love with the neighbor across the way from him, whom he looks at through. She stands on the roof and he looks out his window and he sees her, but then she manages to, you know, it's always unrequited, and she goes off to marry someone else. And this is part of his discomfort. And he asks questions to the inscriptions on the wall. Where are you now, Shireen? What happened to you, Dhammo? And they can never respond. So he's never actually, it's not just that it's unrequited love, it's the lack of recognition that he cannot get recognized. So he has no masculinity anymore. And this is true, I think, of a lot of stories of this period. With regard to the second question, which was about, exhibitionism. Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful question. And I actually had not thought about it in these terms, but I think what you say is absolutely true, that she is exhibiting a kind of, well, she's performing a kind of anger and also of this like high moral ground. And I think that's true about the other story too in different ways. And I guess what I would say is that, you know, Jayakanthan, a lot like a lot of the Nayi Kahani writers too, their stories became sort of the first of art film that arose in the 70s, you know. And so I think there's something filmic about and performative about, it's a performance of gender, yes, but it's also about the way the styles that these stories are written, so that, you know, like it cuts from the window, the scene, you know, the elephant is described in such very clear visual terms, the images are very, very compact and present. I think they're working together, and I need to think about this more. Thank you for that question.
I don't know if our audience has any question. I think Dr. Shiba, you've already asked them, right?
Yeah, there is a question by Shweta Rath. So Shweta, if you could unmute your mic and you can go ahead and ask a question.
I had this question that the whole idea of women being reinvented, or this idea of new women in terms of their sexuality, it has been happening since way back. We can take the song of the Hindi song Nahi Nahi Abhi Nahi Thoda Karo Intezar, or like later on we can take how they have taken themselves as the protagonist, as their own narrator in movies like Lajja or Chandni Bar. And it has been happening even now. We have movies like recent one, Gangubai Kathiawadi. There are people who are speaking their own narratives. So this whole idea of women being reinventing themselves and restating themselves, does it somehow feels the same as the story that you told of the woman being in the room and she keeps looking at the window? Like the women, they are given a chance to speak about themselves and to say how that yes, they are owning their sexuality, but they have to do it in every single time period. Does this mean that women will have to keep on talking about their own sexuality and owning it up, because there is so much of misogyny still left in the world that we can't just do it in one single stance, and we have to keep doing it? What are your views on it?
Yeah, that's actually a very complex question. And one thing I would say is I think we have to understand what is happening in the post-independence moment within the trajectory of a sort of the problem of from the 19th century onwards of the way in which colonialism, I guess, unfolded, and how, in fact, the centrality of social reform in the formation of nationalism and debates about community and language and culture in the subcontinent. And so if you think in those terms, it really, the figure of the woman becomes central to all of these debates. And so it actually becomes the key means through which at any given moment, the terms of identity and community play out. And we have not escaped from this paradigm to this moment. And so even though we can see shifts, right? We can see shifts so that someone like Nirmala and Premchand's Nirmala, she has to go back into the domestic fold. Or, you know, Miss Malti and Godan, she has to sort of, even if she doesn't go back into the domestic fold, she becomes a very elevated figure at the end of that novel. You know, she attains this kind of transcendence type of feminine desire, or we see these in Tagore's novels too. But in the post-independence moment, the new woman does not go back into the domestic fold, and this is throwing things off. It doesn't mean that, but she still becomes the key node around which questions of identity and community are turning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. Do we have other questions? Otherwise, I have one more for you. I thought, what would your response be to this association? Because that kind of seems like a comeuppance and seems like, you know, a stereotypical narrative where this young woman in the last narrative that you mentioned, forget the name, where she's raped. And so the association of desire, the payback, it seems, I know, you know, your paper got truncated and you had to sort of abruptly end it. And I do apologize for that, but we wouldn't have this wonderful discussion, but for, you know, that sort of break. So I was wondering if you could comment on this violence and association of desire with violence, that the desire is met with violence, which also was another thing that I thought of in Satya's story, that he sort of takes the knife to the wall and he sort of so violently disfigures that wall. It seems like desire is interrupted through violence or you know, broken up with violence. So this association I found not only stereotypical, but also threatening in a way. So if you could just comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I sincerely don't know if I can explain it exactly. I agree with you. And, you know, I'm also thinking of, you know, a film like Devdas, Bimal Roy's Devdas from 55. You know, there are these key moments of violence that are legitimated simply because they're not spoken about. And there's another short story that in the book I read, Kamaleshwar's story about, oh no, I'm sorry, the Kitne Pakistan. And this is the short story version. It's not his, it's not the novel that he published later, but there again, it's actual partition violence is occurring in that story. And the story actually resolves around the impossibility of a Muslim woman being able to be with a Hindu man. And so what happens in this story is that the violence is there, and it is like people cannot contend with it. And I think this is what I mean by this idea of post-colonial indignation and disconsolation, that there are these deep-seated violences and antagonisms that are present in post-colonial Indian society, but they simply cannot be spoken about. So they are also present in the stories and in the films, but they're sort of papered over at the same time.
That's the disturbing part. It's almost like the narrative sanctions it, legitimizes it. And especially, you know, we live in a culture which in a lot of ways is patriarchal, is reciprocating the patriarchy of the past. And also the Hindutva movement is very disturbing for some of us who are of the, you know, left of center politics and liberal. So, you know, this chest beating, which comes across as you have to contain the female body in so many ways. This discourse over over hijab, that women don't have a right to their own body, that they can be told when to shed clothes and when to wear clothes, and that can be thought of as legitimate, and the violence embedded in it can be elided over is disturbing to me, and that how the narratives in these two cases at least disregarded and legitimized it. So yeah, we are reciprocating those movements again. Any other questions from our audience?
Thank you for the session. And in a world that is rapidly changing, and also when internet is becoming the cultural vehicle, a lot of cultures are it's on the top. Like, we get to know things. Even the people in the post-colonial countries, like, we get to know a lot of things that we didn't know before, because of how the speed of culture, it's moving, and it's changing everywhere. And still, don't you think the people are stuck with the idea where they consider new women as in a negative, with a negative shade, or either a devilish creature, and in a way the old traditional women or the women who chooses the traditional roles, they are again frowned upon if they are even aware of the things they are doing. Also, even if they are choosing it, then too, we see aren't people still stuck with the binaries or the roles that the gender, a particular gender is supposed to do, and all of that?
I think this speaks to the enduring power of literary representations and film representations of this early moment, and that fact that we are still contending with some of these. I mean, the discourses haven't changed in some ways, but I do want to say something like, we can also turn to other literary and filmic representations and cultural representations in general, and simply because I'm thinking of this immediate post-independence moment, someone like Kamala Das is extraordinary for the way that she portrays feminine desire and sexuality that I think, might slip out of some of these paradigms that I've just presented for you today. And so, I think we can look for these places where people are able to do incredibly creative things with language and with visual imagery and with sound to change the discourses. And so, I hope that my future work moves in that direction in some ways.
Thank you.
Dr. Preetha, I'm just intrigued to know, have you gone through the writings of Ismat Chugtai? Because we hear a lot about her when it comes to post-colonial literature.
I know. She's such an incredible writer. And actually, I'm just starting a new project that's more focused solely on women's writing. And, I'm embarrassed that I don't know Urdu that well, because, there's Chugtai she's been published widely in Hindi magazines. I see her work all over the place, but I have no idea who is doing that. Is it just a transliteration? Is it an actual translation? Who is doing the publishing of the stories of Chugtai in these magazines in Hindi in this moment? And her work is, yes, I think this is a place where I think I can sort of think in new ways about how gender might be playing out, or tropes of gender might be playing out. She's a very key figure.
I would say the same thing of Amrita Preetham. I find her writing as well as really forward-looking, and it deals with sexuality in such poignant ways, especially partition, post-partition violence, pre-partition, during partition violence, and how a woman's relationship with her body. I'm thinking of, there have been movies made, but I don't think it does any justice to the literature. Pinjar being a case in point. I think Amrita Preetham is a fantastic writer. Of course, I don't read any Punjabi,
But
I
the
read
same
her.
question is there about Preetham, is that she's also published in Hindi magazines, and who is doing the translating? And Amrita Preetham did write in Hindi too, but it's very curious how I think Krishna Shrodhi should be put into this discussion as well. And these are all key figures that I hope to look at in my next project, because they're all working with language in these strange ways and also with gender in very interesting ways. Yes, thank you.
I think there is a question in the chat box. Would someone want to, do you want to read it? Were you going to read it? Sorry. Something to do with, it says, do you agree that if desire is violated by violence and is stereotypical, then the vice versa could also be true? Like there would be desires experienced in violence, which is also biased and suppressed. Is this Kajal Singh?
Okay, so thank you for this question. I guess, could I ask you, do you have an example?
Yeah, yes.
Ma'am, I have read some of the writings of Northeast and some of Mahashweta Devi's, but I could not really remember any of the short stories name right now. But I think what I was able to grasp from that short stories was that the vice versa could also be true, and which is often more, biased and suppressed in our society. And like in most of the rape stories and cases we see, uh, this part is most often, it is I think it is repressed, that you experience some sort of desires while facing those that violence, but it should not be mentioned because it is a taboo. you know you are victim, so you cannot really say that.
That's such a great question. I am so glad you brought up this, the issue of literatures of the Northeast and other images of where violence is sort of an everyday part of life, and of course comes into the stories in certain ways. And I agree with you. And I guess the one example that comes to my mind is maybe the short stories of Manto. Maybe that's what you mean, something along those lines, where a lot of the characters and stories in his stories are, it's impossible to separate desire and violence from each other because they're sort of, they're intermeshed in different ways. And yes, thank you for your question.
I would actually ask Kajal to also take a moment, and think about associating desire with violence in such ways, because it again legitimizes the discourse that she asked for it, that you are somehow complicit in your in a violence against you, because rape is not necessarily and is not about desire. Rape is about power, violence, all of that. So it is terrifying to me to think that rape has any elements of desire built into it, because then the discourse again comes back to the patriarchal assertion that really you have been complicit in this. And I don't necessarily want a rape survivor to be sort of constructed only in terms of victimhood, because that is not what I'm saying here, that she should be perceived as a victim. She is not. She's a survivor. She is an agent in her own destiny, because rape is something that happens to her, but is not something that defines her. So I get that part, but in just saying that somehow rape desire is part of rape, I think we again fall into that trap of the patriarchy telling us she asked for it. She was wearing a certain kind of clothes. She really was feeling and was giving out the vibes. And so hence she got what she wanted, really. So that part is a little bit disturbing to me.
I guess one thing I would add, thank you for that, Dr. Banerjee. I also add then what the stories seem to be doing, what fiction and literature seem to be doing is asking us, it's showing the problematic overlay of the two, right? And it's asking us as readers to try and separate them out. because what, you know, the discomfort that you feel when you read a story like Agni Pravesham, this Tamil short story by Jayakanthan, is precisely because the two are being put together in ways that they're asking us to separate them out. I hope that makes sense. That's it. Just that you know, we are being asked to look more deeply at the intersection of these desires.
Yeah, because I think discourses work in patriarchal context. Discourses work towards sort of camouflaging that. Discourses often, patriarchal discourses work towards legitimizing that violence. And in a country like India, where violence against women is quite, I mean, violence against women in America too, you know, is quite high. So, but in a country like India, that is much more disturbing when we say that. Yet, yes, she is a participant in her own, you know, rape. So that makes it really sort of a gray area there. The other thing that I don't know, how are we doing on time? Are we?
We can take another 5 minutes and then we can wrap
Sure,
it up.
if Dr. Mani permits us. We've been, you know, imposing on her kindness. I was wondering if you can, I actually, from your larger work, when I knew that I would be in the same session as you, I looked at your larger work and I had some questions about the book, which I'm sure you're all excited, coming out in August. So congratulations yet again. But one commentary that I did have, or a little question that I did have, is when the father, you know, in that Tamil story, and I found it absolutely fascinating, when the father watches the daughter watching the marriage procession, and he interprets it as this you know, uncontained desire, that she needs to be contained. I think that is almost, again, a psychosexual moment that a father is not supposed to have with the daughter, that in his impulse to contain her, there's something incestuous about it, that he is thinking about controlling her sexuality. And I understand that patriarchy allows him to do that, but that makes it a little more, you know, disturbing in a certain way. Did you have any comment on that?
Not exactly. Thank you so much these are really wonderful insights into the stories, you know, because once you develop a certain way that you want to tell the story, you kind of forget the other details that are always striking when you think back on them. The one thing I would say is that, you know, this is why Jayakanthan is both extraordinarily popular in the time, you know, is a towering figure in Tamil literature, yet he is so deeply problematic at the same time. You know, a lot of his characters do this kind of thing, you know, and what he was known for, what made him so controversial as well as so popular, is the very ways in which he could just bring this kind of sexual desire, male and female, to the fore in such disturbing ways, which ring true at the same time, you know, because that is what the sort of social fabric is at the same time. And I would need to think about this more. I wonder if you have thoughts about it.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of, and I come to it, as I say, from the, you know, the transatlantic tradition, the squarely Brit-lit tradition that I am schooled in, and my sort of experience of living and teaching in the United States for the last 2 decades. I was thinking of it. Yeah, my first visceral response was yiki. You know, you were thinking, you know, why is the father? But then I thought, the very act of marriage is that, right? Your father gives you away, in a way, permits you to have a psychosocial sexual relationship with another man. In any religion, your father gives you away. So that there is that aspect. And then, in a really warped sort of a way, it brought me, or what it brought to my mind is how in this whole American purity movement, women, or rather little girls, you know, 5, 6, 7 teenagers, you promise themselves to their dads. And this is a Christian fundamentalist movement where in the purity movement, they're promising themselves to their dad till dad permits them to get married to somebody, and then they can have their heteronormative sort of relationship. And that in itself again, is a really bizarre thing, that dad is getting married to his little girl, and that is disturbing, and that is what I thought of when you were reading that part of your paper, and I thought, why is he inserting himself in this marriage procession? If, yeah, she's having a moment, so let her have the moment. Why does he think immediately that I need to insert myself because somehow I am part of that sexual energy and need to sort of contain it? So that's what I thought. But
yeah, and the Brahmin woman in that story, she both facilitates that and also is sort of vaguely critiquing it at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Banerjee and Dr. Mani. It was really enriching and really engaging discussion. We, all of us, enjoyed a lot. And I think even our participants have enjoyed a lot. It was very thought-provoking, I would say. Very thought-provoking discussion, giving the backdrop of what has been happening in India. And since you can see I wear hijab, and so I can relate to it a lot more. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you
to
both.
you. It is, your right to do whatever you want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Dr. Mani. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Hope we would like to engage with you in future even more. And all the best for your book, Dr. Mani. And
thank you so much.
once your book is out in after publishing, maybe we can have another talk with you.
I would love that. And thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. Your questions and comments are wonderful, and I'm going to keep thinking about them.